Inequality never disappeared. It simply learned to speak the language of efficiency. Welcome to another scene from the book, The History of Economics in 25 Scenes. Today I'll tell you about the new political economy and why inequality returned, not as a failure of the system, but as one of its features. By the late 20th century, economics had rebuilt its confidence. Markets were refined, models expanded, data multiplied. Growth resumed, globalization accelerated. And yet, beneath the surface of recovery, an old tension sharpened. Wealth rose, but it rose unevenly. Prosperity clustered, opportunity narrowed. The promise that markets would naturally spread their gains began to sound hollow. What made this moment different was not the existence of inequality, but its justification. Disparities were no longer explained as temporary frictions or moral failures. They were reframed as incentives, as signals, as the necessary price of efficiency in a competitive world. If outcomes diverged, it meant the system was working. The new political economy did not ask whether inequality was just. It asked whether it was productive. Power returned, not through crowns or factories, but through finance, networks, and policy. The market was no longer a neutral arena. It became a force that shaped politics, culture, and identity itself. This is where the story turns again. Not toward revolution, but toward a quieter question. What happens when inequality is no longer a problem to solve, but a condition to manage? The early 21st century strips economics of its last illusions. The crash of 2008 shatters the myth of the self-regulating market. The COVID-19 pandemic then exposes something even deeper: how fragile a global system becomes when it is built for efficiency rather than resilience. Behind the language of equilibrium and optimization, a harder truth comes into view. The economy is not an impersonal machine. It is a web of interests, hierarchies, and power. Every rule, every algorithm, every bailout has winners. The market that once claimed neutrality now looks unmistakably political. Decisions about credit, trade, technology, or supply chains are no longer technical tweaks. They are acts of governance. And a question economics tried to exile for more than a century returns with force. Who rules the economy, and in whose name? The fantasy of a world beyond politics collapses. In its place emerges a new realism: the recognition that policy, finance, and ideology are woven together. There is no clean boundary between markets and power, only shifting arrangements of influence. This does not kill economics, it changes it. The discipline rediscovers itself as a moral and social science. Economists once again borrow from sociology, history, and ethics. They ask how trust, fairness, and legitimacy hold markets together. Growth alone no longer suffices as a measure of success. The question becomes distributive. For whom does growth work? And at what cost to democracy, equality, and the planet? The age of innocence ends the moment the invisible hand is caught holding a balance sheet. The market, once imagined as a realm of freedom, reveals its political soul, an arena where power writes the rules and wealth decides who gets to play. The so-called new political economy grows out of disappointment. Disappointment with the old promise that markets could ever be neutral. Instead of studying ideal systems from textbooks, it looks at the real world, where power, interest, and advantage constantly collide. Its starting point is quietly subversive. Economics and politics are not separate realms. They are two languages describing the same struggle over who gets what. James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock make this explicit with public choice theory. They suggest that democracy itself behaves like a market. Politicians, bureaucrats, and voters are not selfless guardians of the common good. They pursue their own interests, trading influence for benefit. Votes, budgets, and laws become currencies. The state no longer appears as a moral referee, but as a competitive arena, where lobbying replaces invisible hands with very visible deals. Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson extend this logic to entire civilizations. In Why Nations Fail, they argue that prosperity depends less on geography or resources than on institutions. Inclusive institutions, those that protect rights, encourage innovation, and spread opportunity, sustain growth. Extractive institutions, captured by elites, concentrate wealth, deepen inequality, and eventually undermine themselves. Taken together, these perspectives expose an uncomfortable truth. Markets never float freely. They operate inside rules, and those rules are written by those with power. Capital flows not only toward efficiency, but toward influence. Regulation becomes ideology. Fiscal policy becomes strategy. The boundary between economics and governance dissolves. The new political economy abandons comforting myths and looks directly at reality. A dense web of interests, where morality competes with self-preservation and prosperity is inseparable from power. Inequality becomes the central fault line of the 21st century, no longer mainly between nations or even ideologies, but between those who own and those who do not. What once sounded like a moral complaint hardens into something colder, a structural pattern. Thomas Piketty gives it a stark formula. When the return on capital grows faster than the economy itself, wealth accumulates faster than wages can ever catch up. Ownership, not effort, begins to decide destiny. This is not a temporary failure of policy. It is how the system behaves when left to itself. The market does not correct inequality. It organizes it. With that, ethics returns to the center of economics. Profit and labor stop looking neutral. They reveal themselves as political forces shaping hierarchy. Capital is rewarded for patience. Labor is punished for urgency. The invisible hand turns into a sorting mechanism, quietly separating privilege from precarity. Others push the argument further. Joseph Stiglitz and Mariana Mazzucato show that the state is not capitalism's enemy, but its silent partner. The internet, GPS, green energy, even mRNA vaccines emerge not from private daring alone, but from public risk. The state acts as the ultimate venture capitalist, absorbing uncertainty while private actors capture the gains. And now a new elite appears: the owners of data. In the age of big tech, power no longer rests mainly in land or factories, but in algorithms. Information becomes property. Code becomes authority. Inequality changes its vocabulary, from money to data, but not its nature. It remains the oldest story in economics: ownership deciding whose freedom counts. The new political economy quietly brings economics back to where it always began, with moral choice. After a century of claiming scientific distance, the discipline rediscovers an uncomfortable truth. No model is neutral. No equation is innocent. Every decision about taxation, labor, or regulation is an ethical statement about the kind of world a society chooses to build. Numbers may look objective, but they always carry values. Policies distribute dignity as surely as they distribute income. This return of conscience is not nostalgia, it is necessity. When inequality widens and institutions lose legitimacy, technical adjustments stop working. Growth figures cannot repair trust. Efficiency cannot substitute for justice. Economics is forced to confront the question it tried to exile: what is fair? Freedom and equality, innovation and stability, these are not variables to optimize away. They are tensions to be navigated through deliberate choice. The economist becomes less an engineer, chasing perfect systems, and more a custodian of consequences. Every policy redraws a moral map. Taxes, subsidies, and regulations do more than shift resources. They decide who carries risk, and who enjoys protection? Who is rescued in a crisis, and who is left to absorb the shock? To govern the economy is to choose whose insecurity is acceptable. In recognizing this, economics rejoins the conversation it once abandoned. It stands again beside law, ethics, and philosophy, not as a science of certainty, but as a discipline of responsibility. The 21st century does not demand a new utopia. It demands honesty, that prosperity without fairness corrodes itself, and that every market, beneath its data, hides the moral image of the civilization it serves. The new political economy, for all its sharp vision, inherits the oldest dilemma of public life: how to reconcile freedom with fairness, how to pursue efficiency without sacrificing morality. Every attempt to humanize capitalism risks slowing its dynamism. Every push for growth threatens to widen inequality. The state that steps in to protect also learns how to control. The market that promises liberation can just as easily abandon. Between security and dependence lies a narrow ridge no society manages to walk for long. This tension resurfaces in every reform. Redistribution aims at justice, yet can weaken initiative. Austerity rewards discipline, yet punishes the vulnerable. Regulation protects, but can stifle innovation. Deregulation frees, but exposes risk. Wherever policy intervenes, intention collides with consequence. Economists can measure outputs and incentives, but they cannot quantify legitimacy. And once trust in fairness erodes, even prosperity begins to feel hollow. The new political economy recognizes this trap, but cannot dissolve it. Power, once analyzed, remains power. Self-interested, adaptive, and unavoidable. To demand perfect liberty and perfect equality at once is to ask for a contradiction. Civilization survives not by resolving this tension, but by constantly negotiating it. Perhaps the deeper lesson is humility. Systems do not fail simply because they are poorly designed, but because they are lived in by human beings. Ambitious, anxious, impatient. The dilemmas of policy mirror the contradictions of character. Every budget, every reform, every law becomes an experiment in coexistence. A fragile effort to align what works with what is right, knowing that neither ever fully wins.